I think it's great by this point of the conference that there's going to be some repetition, which I think means consensus. So forgive me if I'm echoing some of the things that have already been said. So I've kind of titled this talk, "With Friends Like These, the Need for Harmony and Shared Vision in the Left." And I really kind of came to this point after I heard Richard Dennis speak at the ACTU's Secure Jobs, Better Future community summit that was held a few weeks ago. And Richard declared that the left was losing badly. And I kind of started thinking and speaking to a lot of my friends that I regard to be progressive as to why exactly that is. And I've come to the conclusion that it's for two reasons. And the first is that we lack any type of unity or cohesion between left participants. And I think it's at the point now that we can kind of, and someone else has used the phrase sectarian fighting and infighting. I called it civil war. I think that's damaging us enormously and really just playing into the hands of our Tory counterparts, who I think are much more cohesive and united than we are. And I think a reason for that lack of coherence is this idea that we lack a type of umbrella policy, broad-based framework that we can all unite behind. So that's what I'm going to be putting forward. So the infighting. So it's a lack of cohesion in the left, and it manifests itself in this kind of really narcissistic infighting and mud-flinging between primarily the ALP and the Greens, and I'm just kind of completely sick of it, and I think it's just such a wasted use of energy. And I think a good example of this is on the matter of the response to climate change that we saw after the 2007 election. We had an amazing 2007 election result, and how somehow we've managed to lose the public on this issue. Like, the mind boggles when we look at 2007 and where we are now. The Greens dug their heels in for the policy, obviously giving too much to polluters. The ALP's leadership deemed it too politically difficult. And all the while this happened, and we failed to kind of articulate to the public what exactly taking action on climate change meant. So we did no education during that process. And I think it got to the point where the carbon tax slogan stuck and did enormous political damage and continues to do political damage today. So I think, now we're at a point where the policy has been implemented, and we can see that it's starting to have a positive effect in reducing emissions, and we're seeing an increased investment in renewable energy sector. And I think the left, the ALP, the Greens and our other civil society partners have stopped talking about it. So despite the fact that I think this is an issue that we have not necessarily won but done enormous things on, we stopped talking about it. And the carbon tax and the July, messaging continues to dominate this issue. And I think it's a really big example of how much the infighting and the lack of cohesion in the left is just playing into the hands of the right. And I think another example is on marriage equality. And I won't go into this too much, but the fact that at one point we had 4 marriage equality bills in Parliament at once, how the left has not managed to get together and work cohesively on something like this, I think just dilutes our message to the public. So I think this is made all the worse in the left in Australia by how cohesive our Tory counterparts effectively work. So they are a functional broad church. So on climate change, for example, the Coalition Party room, and you all know this, but I'm just pointing out the obvious, contains members who don't believe in climate change, others who don't believe it is caused by humans, others who don't believe the market can be trusted to reduce emissions. And all of these individuals sit alongside the Malcolm Turnbulls of the Coalition, and many of them also served on Howard's front bench when he took an emissions trading policy to the 2007 election. So I really think that this is an example of how the right has this broad-based umbrella approach that we are lacking. So their umbrella framework kind of encompasses, obviously, smaller government, less tax, sensible economic management. And they really have participants with really varied, ideological threads that somehow manage to fall behind this broad-based framework without bickering. And I think what that does is just gives legitimacy to their messaging and to their issues, and it makes us look the complete opposite, that we do not have a united front. And I think it's clear at this point that the threat of a common enemy is not enough for the left in Australia, because we look at the state that we're in and the possibility and I hate to say likelihood of an Abbott government. It's simply not enough for us to stop the infighting. So what I'm proposing is a new kind of shared policy umbrella framework. And it's been really informed by the human rights movement that we've seen emerge in the last few decades. And I really think the human rights discourse, and I'm involved in a couple of human rights organisations, it's really dominating the social justice sphere at the moment. So that kind of language, that really rights-based approach to equality is dominating civil society and kind of left participants in civil society. And I think you can see it in a lot of women's organising, that rights kind of language is dominating in that sphere, and a lot of GLBTI groups as well are using it with much success. And I think it's because talking about equality in a rights kind of language is really successful in individualising disadvantage. You hear about someone's individual right, and you can immediately associate it with someone in your life who is missing out on that equality. I do think that the human rights framework does have limitations, and being a trade unionist, I think it's because it does tend to be inherently individualistic. And I want to explore now how I think the left, but specifically the trade union movement, can adopt a human rights-based approach to organising and to messaging, and I think it can be really successful. So when I talk about human rights framework, I'm specifically talking about substantive equality. So I'm not talking about individual rights that I think can be disassociated from community and disassociated from sociology. I think it really needs to be about substantive equality, which requires that disadvantage is addressed by not only eliminating discrimination, but by alleviating inherent disadvantage that some groups in society experience. And it also captures, I think the substantive equality framework also captures marginalised groups who are left out and discriminated against because of stigmatisation and marginalisation. So to quickly use a bit of a case study, let's look at human rights and labour rights. So as I mentioned, I am involved in a couple of human rights organisations, and it's always really baffled me why the labour rights movement and the human rights movement fail to intersect. So I think that they're both on the economic and political left, and they both seek to protect the weak and the vulnerable. And yet there seems to be a complete lack of cohesion between the two. And I think it's essential that unions revitalising, that they adopt a different type of approach to unionism. So there's firstly a couple of structural differences between the two and why they fail to intersect. It's obviously unions are membership-based organisations that have to be representative for the members. Human rights organisations are not. They rely on donors and supporters. So that's a big structural difference. And also the role that unions have in having another party involved in the course of bargaining, so having to inherently compromise because of the role of employers in the work that they do. Human rights organisations don't have that. Compromise is weakness for them. And they're also quite reliant on litigation, which I think, again, is quite individualistic. So I think what it ultimately comes down to, and a big thing that I've come out of this weekend, is this need for the union movement to move towards social movement unionism. And that's especially important when we look at young workers who are increasingly becoming casual and temporary and freelance, for example. So I think the adoption of a human rights approach is not necessarily the answer to union revitalisation, and obviously any type of move away from collectivism in the union movement will be a nail in our coffin. But I think better framing the goal of unionism as an economic and social right, and how that fits within ideas of substantive equality, and how those economic, social and cultural rights make us more equal society, is a shift that will reframe the union movement as a social movement, rather than this third-party bargaining bargaining agent, Dave Kerrin, who's been here this weekend, talks about how EBA unionism has really contributed to the death of the movement. So I think this substantive equality framework sets unionism as a movement that encompasses the interests of union members and non-unions alike. And in this precarious, direction that our workforce is taking, the union movement must adopt a new framework. And I think the left can take a lot from that as well.
You certainly covered a lot of territory there, and I think